If you're looking for a fun and easy woven wall hanging to make, this video is for you. Let's get started. So for this project, I'm going to use linen warp string, one of my favorites. The list of materials and tools will be linked down below. I'm going to single warp a total of 30 strings onto my loom. So the next thing I'm going to do is just tape down my loom so it doesn't shift on us. And then we're going to start this weaving how I like to start every single weaving, putting on the warp, adding twining and plain weave and cardstock so that you have a solid base. My cardstock is about 2.5 inches tall, and I'm just going to weave this in with plain weave, which is just over one, under one. I want to do a bit of a shorter fringe on this piece just for something different. So I'm thinking I'm going to use this book for cutting out my fringe. For the fringe, I'm going to be using recycled cotton string in 2 different sizes. So I'm going to cut 15 pieces of 5mm and 15 pieces of 3mm. Each piece is about 14 inches long. For each group of fringe, I'm going to be using one of the strands of 5mm and one of the strands of 3mm, and we're going to work around 2 strings at a time. So I'm taking 2 strings, I'm holding my fringe in my hands like this, so right in the middle, and I'm going to take the right string, wrap it around in through the center, and then my left strings and do the same. So wrapping around and in through the center. Then I'm going to match up the ends. You can see that my thinner string was a little bit longer, but that's okay. So I'm going to match up the ends of the string, and then I can pull them down to the bottom. So one of each size, holding them somewhat in the middle, going to the next 2 strings, the right string, wrap around and in through the middle, the left string, wrap around and in through the middle, match up the ends and pull them down. So now I'm doing that all the way across the loom. All right, so now I have my fringe on and I'm gonna get started with the weaving. I'm using a thicker dowel for the top of this that I stained. It's just drying at the moment, but I know that I wanna leave about 4 inches from the top of my loom to compensate for the thickness of the dowel that I wanna wrap the loops around later. So that leaves me with about 7 inches to work with. The first thing I'm going to do is 4 rows of plain weave with this plied yarn. Remembering that plain weave is our most basic form of weaving, it's also called tabby, and it's just weaving over one string, under one string, and then doing the opposite on the next row. I'm always remembering to create that arch before I beat down that weft, which is our horizontal string. The reason we do that is so that there's enough slack that it doesn't make your warp tighter and tighter as you go. When I turn around, I'm not pulling my yarn super tight. I'm actually gonna hold it there and secure it, create that arch. You can even strum your warp before you go ahead and beat it down. Now that I'm at the end and I've ended my row with going under the warp string, I'm actually just gonna go back over top with it. I'm not weaving it through here. I'm just gonna leave that over top just so that it's kind of somewhat tucked into the back already, but we'll tuck the rest in later. Now that I have those 4 rows in, we're ready to get started with some merino wool roving. This is such a simple weaving design, but it looks so pretty at the end. So you're gonna want 3 different colors of merino wool roving. And I'm starting out, I have about 1 ounce here, and I'm actually gonna split it so that it's half as thick. This is one way that you can make your merino wool roving go a little bit further. So you'll kind of see that there's a bit of a natural split happening here. So really, really gently, I'm just gonna start pulling that apart. So I'm gonna just let it gently come apart. You don't wanna go tearing through this. So you can see that it's not gonna split perfectly, but I'm kind of just okay with that. So just really gently letting that kind of fall apart. So I'm gonna put the other section aside, and we're gonna be weaving this a variation of plain weave. So it's going to be over 2 strings, under 2 strings, instead of only over 1, under 1. So I'm going over 2, under 2. I'm just using my hands for this just so I can more gently weave the roving in. Then over here, I'm gonna leave a nice long tail. I'm still gonna create that arch, and I'm gonna use my weaving comb to just beat it down. Then for the next row, we're going under 2, over 2, and I can just do a few at a time just so that we're not dragging all this merino wool roving too aggressively through. You can see how I let it twist a nice way so that the edge is clean. And I'm just sort of making sure that instead of it being twisted as I go, I'm letting it be flat. So now we're gonna weave one last row of this. And again, letting that twist over the edge really nicely. So now I have 3 rows in, which is all I want. And I'm noticing over here, like let's tuck this in and just look at this to make sure everything is still looking pretty straight, and it does to me. Now we wanna leave a nice long tail. You don't have to cut merino wool roving. You're gonna hold one side in your hand on the right and the other in the left. Make sure your hands are nice and far apart, and you're just gonna start gently pulling. And the roving will come apart just like this. Now this is a much longer tail than I needed, so the next ones I'll try to make sure that I'm not leaving quite as much on the end. We're gonna grab more of the off-white yarn, and we're going to do another 4 rows of plain weave. Now it really doesn't matter which side you start on for this, but since I started and stopped both on the right side for the first section, I'm just gonna go ahead and stagger that and do the next section on the left. So I'm going back to that over 1, under 1 plain weave for 4 rows. Just like the other side, I'm gonna trim off some of the excess. We're gonna wrap this back around that far string and just let it kind of tuck into the back for now. Now we're ready for our second color. I've already split this piece apart, but I'm using this beautiful sort of pinky corally color, and I'm just gonna do the same thing that I did before. So starting on the left, going over 2 under 2. You can start from the left or the right, it really doesn't matter. I'm just kind of keeping with what I did in the previous section. So you can see this gives us a bit of a basket weave texture, which I think is really pretty. So again, now we're gonna pull this apart. I'm gonna try to leave this tail a little bit shorter this time, and that worked out a little bit better. Then I'm going to go in with the off-white yarn again with 4 rows. So we're gonna go in with the last color now, and I'm using this beautiful honey yellow color. So just like with the green and the pink, I'm going to split this. Okay, what is happening? Once again, I'm going to split it in half and weave in 3 rows. So this time I'm gonna do 5 rows of plain weave, and then we're gonna use that last row to do our twining stitch. So after my 5th row of plain weave, I'm gonna leave a really nice long tail, and this piece is a little bit on the short side, so I'm gonna grab a new one that's a bit longer, and I'm gonna be using this for my twining stitch. So I'm working from where the yarn looped around to where the tail is, and the reason we have to add a new piece of string is because if we were to just turn around, going across something so wide like this, it would actually just keep pulling in that side tighter and tighter as we go, and we definitely don't want that. We want to try to keep our sides or selvages as straight as we can. Now we're ready to flip this over and start tucking in the ends. The first thing I like to do is just bring all of those ends that were in the front to the back so that we don't miss any as we're tucking them in. And we're gonna start with the roving. These are pretty tight spots, so we are gonna use a little yarn needle. This is just a plastic one. You can find these pretty much anywhere that sells yarn. And I'm going to grab the end of my roving, thread it through the needle, and we're just going to be weaving this or stitching this back in. So you can grab one or both of the warp strings, and we're just going to go ahead and pull this through. Now you don't want to, oh, my needle came unthreaded. You don't want to pull it too tight so that it's doing this. See how it's sucking in too close to the edge there? You want to leave it loose enough that your edge is still nice and straight with the other things that are going on here. So I like to stitch these through probably just 2 sections. This weaving is pretty tight, so they are gonna stay in just fine. And this is the part where we are gonna use scissors on the roving. So I have this really long tail, so I'm just gonna go ahead and trim it shorter, but I'm still leaving it long enough that it's not gonna just slip out of where we stitched it. So now we can do that with all the wool roving. We're ready to start tucking in the yarn, so I'm gonna show you how to do that. We're gonna use the same little yarn needle. You can cut off some of the ends if they're really, really long. What I like to do is sort of fold over the yarn, squish it, and that makes it a little bit easier to get it through the eye of this needle. Then what we're gonna do is we're gonna go through some of these little channels. So I'm gonna bring it through this one, just grabbing the loop on the back of the piece and not going all the way through the piece. So I'm gonna pick a couple loops there, pull it through gently. Again, making sure that we're not pulling it in so that looks nice and straight there. And then cutting off the excess, being careful not to cut anything other than just the yarn you tucked in. Again, just grabbing a couple of loops, gently pulling it through. And just like with the roving, I am leaving a tiny bit of a tail so that it doesn't just pop out from where we tucked it in. Now we're ready to take this piece off the loom. You can see from the front now, it looks nice and clean. So I'm just gonna flip all of my fringe over to the top of the piece, and then I'm gonna slide out the cardstock that I had in. From there, I should be able to slip this off my loom. If your warp is really, really tight and you have a loom like this one, it might be worth taking out these screws just so that you don't damage the loom as you take the strings off. But if it's not too tight, what you can do is grab 2 warp strings and just slip them off the teeth. So I'm pulling them towards those teeth just so that it loosens it up a bit so I don't damage the notches on my loom. Then on the other side, the loom or the weaving will just sort of come off the loom. And we're gonna set the loom aside so that we can finish off the bottom. So I'm actually gonna flip this over and I'm gonna grab just a book or something a little bit heavier just to hold my weaving in place while I tie these knots. What we wanna do is, ideally we're always using the loops to tie the knots that we're about to tie in, but on each end there are sort of a group of 3 because we have the loose ends on each side and then we have a loop after that. So on each very end, I'm gonna tie together 3 strings total, and I'm gonna make sure that they're nice and snug up against that twining stitch we did. And then I can go to the next grouping, which is a nice little loop here, and we're just tying overhand knots snug against the bottom. Overhand knots are so much better than the other just regular style knot because they don't slip at all, so that's why I like to use them for the bottom. Now there's a couple different ways you can finish off the bottom, so I'm gonna show you the 2 different options. Option number 1, if you really want it to be super clean at the bottom, is you're going to weave in a small needle to these ends that we did plain weave on earlier. I'm just gonna cut this little knot off. And once that needle is through, you can thread the needle, pull these through, and then from there, you would just simply cut off the excess so it's really clean on the bottom. Now, if you are like me and you don't always want to tuck in so many ends because you're ready to just get to the part where you have a pretty finished piece, there is another way that you can do this. So since we did those overhand knots, and again, overhand knots, when you pull them really tight, are super secure, what you can do is you can actually just trim these shorter. So I'm gonna leave mine about 1/2 inch, maybe it's a little bit less, and just try to keep them really straight. And that's gonna give you also a clean finish at the bottom. That's an easy way to do that. Now I've set a book on the fringe just to keep this from sliding around too much again. And I'm going to be using 3 loops at a time. Then I'm going to use both hands here with this loop open. I'm going to flip the loop open and then bring these 2 smaller loops together and then slip them over the dowel. And then once they're over the dowel, you can just sort of tighten them up. This is my favorite way now to hang a weaving. It's so quick and simple. And again, I'm going to do 3 more loops, open them up, flip them forward, and then bring those 2 sections of loops together. Slip them on the dowel. We can start scooching this one down and tighten them up. So I'm gonna do that all the way across the piece. So now I'm grabbing the same string I used for the warp and I'm gonna create a hanging string. I like to have my hanging string about 2/3 of the weaving length. I usually like to wrap the string around 3 times, and that always kind of looks good to me. Now I want to check that my fringe is as straight as I want it to be. This is a personal preference. If you want it a little bit more uneven, you can definitely do that. Or if you're like me and you want it fairly straight, but not necessarily perfect, that's what I'm gonna go for today. Okay, it's all finished. I absolutely love it. So let's have a look at the final piece. Here it is. I absolutely love these colors together. And if you enjoyed this video, check out this one next.